Shelley Nolden, the author of The Vines. It is day 4,394, and a special day it is. Shelley will be in conversation with Greer Macallister for this virtual event. Shelley is a Milwaukee-area-based author who is the founder of Grit Health and an advisor to Goal 5, a women's sports apparel company named after the United Nations' 5th Sustainable Development Goal. The Vines is her first novel and also getting wonderful reviews from many places, including Kirkus. Greer Macallister is the author of historical fiction novels, including Girl in Disguise, Woman 99, and The Arctic Fury, which was named an Indie Next and Library Reads pick. She is a regular contributor to Writer Unboxed and the Chicago Review of Books. It is an honor to be hosting both of you. Thank you for coming. Virtual hand.
Really excited to be here, really excited to get the opportunity to talk with Shelley about her debut novel, The Vines. And yeah, so just to kick it off and open it up and say how excited we all are about this book and how wonderful it is. And just to ask you, Shelley, to maybe for the people who are not familiar with the premise, say a little bit about the book and start us out on what we should know.
Okay, great. And before I do that, I'd love to hear where people are from. So if you do want to leave your location in the chat, we'd love to get a sense for who's here. So in the East River in New York City, there's an abandoned island called North Brother Island. This island houses a shuttered quarantine hospital that was used in the late 1800s, early 1900s to treat the New York City's indigent ill that were suffering from contagious diseases. Currently, it's a federally protected bird sanctuary, so it's off limits to the public. And in my novel, The Vines, it is home to a woman with an astonishing immune system who's being held there against her will. So, and speaking of the title, I do see poking out from behind Jael's copy of The Vines, a glass of wine.
Indeed.
So please.
We have vines and vines today.
Yes. Wines and vines are highly encouraged during this conversation.
You could do a whole book club themed thing where you say, bring your own wine and let's talk about the vines. Yeah,
that's actually funny. I did do a detour in the grocery store to the wine section and went through the labels and just selected a selection of bottles based on labels that looked atmospheric with my book and did a picture. So that's on my Instagram account.
There should be a lot. Yeah.
Yes. And now we're working our way through those bottles.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, it looks like we do have great representation. So we've got some local folks from Milwaukee, but we've got as far south as Alabama and South Carolina, as far east as New Jersey, Kansas. This is really great. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
This is sort of the upside of the virtual, of I try to think of it as the pandemic silver lining, because when I've been promoting books, I've been able to, virtually be anywhere, Atlanta or Los Angeles or whatever. And so people who are not necessarily close to the bookstore can still support the bookstore, can still support the book, and participate and hear these, hear authors like Shelley talk about and share inspiration for their book and everything else. And we can definitely, interact. And again, you can put questions into the chat. I'm going to ask questions for a while, but then we're going to ask what you want to know as well. So let's talk a little bit more about North Brother Island, because it's an amazing place. It's very, very close to Manhattan, but it's this whole other world. It's where Typhoid Mary was quarantined, right? And so it's of New York, but completely separate from New York. And you can't even go there now, but you can see images of it and and you have slides, right, to sort of show us some of what inspired you.
Right. Well, so let's poll the audience here. Should we start with a little history or start with the cool pictures? So if anyone wants to throw their view in, then we'll head in that direction. History. All right, history it is. So this island was largely unused before about 1885. They do think that Native Americans used it as a hunting and fishing ground, but there's not fresh water on the island, so historians think it's unlikely that any Native American populations actually dwelled there. But in 1885, as there were more contagious disease outbreaks within New York City, specifically smallpox, the city decided to transfer Riverside Hospital from Blackwell Island to North Brother Island. And so over the course of the next 15, 20 years, they were building out more of the buildings on North Brother Island as they were bringing patients to the island to be treated and quarantined there. I mean, now we've all seen, you know, what quarantine is like and how scary contagions are. Well, back then they knew so much less about how to disinfect and how germs spread. And so the simplest solution was to literally just put these poor people on an island. And they were unfortunately poor people who couldn't afford to be treated in other ways. And so then moving into the early 1900s, there was a terrible tragedy that struck the shore of North Brother Island. At the time, there was a community in New York, which is largely absent now, called Little Germany. And it was centered around a church. That church had its year-end, Sunday school year-end picnic to Locust Grove. They chartered the steamship, the General Slocum. On the ship's way up I have goosebumps right now. I hate that this happened. On the way up the East River, somebody lit a match in a room with some barrels of oil, and there was hay in there as well. It started a fire on the ship. The captain of the ship, rather than grounding it immediately along the docks in Manhattan, continued to head up the East River into a headwind. The company that owned the ship, to save money, had not replaced the life preservers, which were made of cork at the time. And so these life preservers were actually rotting cork. And in past voyages, passengers had complained that the lifeboats rattled when there was a wind, when they were enjoying their pleasure cruises. And so these lifeboats had been wired to the decks. So this fire was spreading. People were being given life jackets that pulled them to the bottom faster, and they couldn't access the lifeboats. The captain eventually ran the ship aground on the southern shore of North Brother Island, and the hospital staff then was the dominant force in the rescue efforts to save people as they were jumping from the ship, trying to get to shore. So it's a terrible tragedy. It's not well known in US history and even New York history. And the theory around why it's not well known is because this almost solely affected the German community. And there was anti-German sentiment following World War I, and then again, of course, following World War II. So when I first learned of North Brother Island, I knew nothing about this. And actually, I have the book. For the history buffs out there, this is a fabulous book about this event, and was very instrumental in me being able to include a scene on this tragedy in my novel. Then the next aspect of North Brother Island's history that I think all of you are aware of, maybe not that she actually lived there, but Typhoid Mary, you know, the most famous asymptomatic carrier, and we now are very familiar with the concept of asymptomatic carriers, was sent to the island in 1907. She had, of course, typhoid fever. She had already infected several people. She was a chef, and so she was passing it to the people she worked for through her cooking. The doctors told her that she could have her gallbladder removed because they thought incorrectly that the germs resided there, or be banished to North Brother Island. So she is sent there. Well, I'll show you a map later, but you'll see where she lived. And she's a secondary character in my novel, which she is a ton of fun to research. She has a spunky personality. Then
and she's better documented than a lot of people at the time, right? Because of who she was. There were interviews. Yeah. There's much more documentation than you would have had for other people at the time, right? Right.
And then as history progressed, or time progressed, the hospitals became better at treating infectious diseases. So the Riverside Hospital became less necessary. When World War I soldiers were returning, The hospital did serve as a rehabilitation facility for drug addicted soldiers. And then in the 1920s through the 1930s, it was largely used to treat tuberculosis and venereal diseases. And then in the 1940s, it housed returning World War II soldiers and their families as the soldiers were studying at New York universities under the GI Bill. Once they'd all earned their degrees, they left. The island was abandoned for a short period. And then someone had the bright idea of turning it into an experimental rehabilitation center for drug addicted teenagers. And so the building that had been built as a tuberculosis treatment center was never used for that purpose, but instead those rooms became isolation cells with metal reinforced doors, deadbolts, grating over the windows, and the teenagers were given, had to do the cold turkey treatment. They figured out that was ineffective. And then in 1963, the island was shuttered for good. And ever since then, a forest has been overtaking the decaying hospital ruins. There's now heron populations that live there. It's a federally protected heron preserve. And under normal circumstances, the New York Park Department can sanction visits there, but during COVID, nobody's allowed there.
So you were not able to see it in person, but this is the historical novelist's like constant, bugbear, right? Is that even if you can go to the place, you can't go to there at the time that you're writing about, but you're able to recreate a lot of it and to sort of imagine yourself into it through photography, right? Through a lot of the documentation, writing of research like the Typhoid Mary documentation, as well as the images, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that process and how you did
Sure. So let me start at how I saw somebody ask what sparked this idea. So most novelists have been approached by somebody and said, you should write a book about, XYZ. And Greer's laughing because she's like, yeah, that's happening.
It happened to me like last week. Yeah.
And what was the topic that was suggested?
I told him, he said, I have this great idea I really think you should write about. And I said, I can't even listen to it. Like my agent won't let me listen to them anymore, because then if I do end up using it, there's some question of who it belongs to. So I don't know what that idea is, but everyone's got a story, right? And some of them are amazing stories, but I always tell people, like, if you have an amazing story that you want to write, you should write it. Like, right. I am not necessarily the person that should write it, because I've already got more ideas that I can use, that I can do justice to. But there are all of these sparks out there, and there are, real life figures and, convergences of ideas that should be books. And this was obviously one of them.
Right. Yeah. So the person who said that to me was my husband. And I think everyone should be happier that I wrote the book instead of him. I love him dearly. But hang on, somebody's running a sink. Yep, they're home from Panera. They've made themselves known. So we were living in the New York City area at the time. We were returning on a plane, and it was descending to LaGuardia Airport. I was sitting in the middle seat, furiously typing on a draft novel at the time. My husband was looking out the window, saw North Brother Island from the window, and that's during the winter. So in the summer, you just see this lush greenery now that it's really become forested. But in the winter, when the trees are barren, you can see the buildings from above and their decaying state. And so he jabbed me in the side, pointed out the window and said, you should write a book about this island. So, I jabbed him back as I leaned over, and I was amazed by what I saw. And right there in the East River, in the middle of the metropolitan area of 8 billion people. Did I say 8 million? Because there are not 8 billion people on our planet. There was an abandoned island with a forest. So when we landed, I might have turned my cell phone on before we fully got to the gate. I don't remember exactly. The details are foggy. But I started researching North Brother Island, and I was amazed by this dark history, how secretive, mysterious it was. And it's like, you are right. I should write a book about this island. And I started researching, but I didn't get very far. And there are many amazing photographs online. At the time, more from urban explorers who didn't have sanctioned access. But the problem I had initially is I knew that the setting for this book would be vital to the story. And so there are two problems. First of all, the pictures I could find online were not labeled because the people who'd taken them either hadn't taken the time to label them or they themselves didn't know the original function of the building. And the other problem is it's just one point in time. And with such a fascinating history, I knew I wanted to tell a story that would span the full history of the island. And so I didn't know what buildings existed at what points. I couldn't have Cora walk into the morgue in 1904 when it didn't exist. So I was at a standstill, and then miraculously, Christopher Payne published this book, which I highly, highly recommend. A few months after that fateful airplane flight. And in the book, not only are there amazing pictures, but they're all labeled with what buildings they are. And he has maps and maps over time. So his book basically served as a key for allowing me to categorize the rest of the resources. And so I went through everything I could find online. There were some 450 pictures I found. And based on his labels, I was able to sort all of the pictures into which buildings they were. So now I had a very clear sense of the setting. So I will screen share to show you some of these pictures. I'll show you Christopher's site. But then also I will show you some pictures. I've been very fortunate to now have the right to share because anyone else's work is copyrighted. I can't share that. But on my author Facebook page, Shelley Nolden author, I had a gentleman comment on one of my posts saying that he had been to the island and taken pictures. And he liked the map that's in the book so much that he told me that he would share his pictures with me and allow me to use them if I sent him a copy of the map. So
how cool is that? Yeah.
Yes. So of course I had it framed because how can you not when someone gives you pictures of your obsession? Yeah. That doesn't sound right, but you get what I'm saying. So all right, so I'll do a screen share. Can I get this to be larger? Okay. All right. So this is the island approaching from the western side. These buildings here that you see, the square one was originally a church and then used as a morgue. The buildings behind it are the physical plant and the coal house, which obviously powered the island. And then you have the ferry gantry to the left, which was built later, but still that location was how most patients arrived on the island. Here we see the Tuberculosis Pavilion. This is the jewel of the island. It was one of the last structures built, the most elaborate, and as I mentioned, was never actually used to treat tuberculosis patients. But in my process of categorizing all of these pictures, they also served as brainstorming ideas for me as I was plotting. So there are the isolation cells in here. And when you look at these creepy isolation cells with metal across the windows, you know, the writer in me had many ideas. And as you read the novel, that you'll remember this comment of mine. You'll see here, these are also pictures of the Tuberculosis Pavilion. These are obviously in winter, but from these, you can see where the book got its name. These are vines that are hanging from the balcony. And one of the treatment methods for tuberculosis was an emphasis on getting fresh air. So that's why most sanatoriums have these exposed areas and walkways. And here we have a tree that has grown through the concrete steps in the main central hall of the Tuberculosis Pavilion. This is an X-ray room that in the Tuberculosis Pavilion, but was never actually used for its intended purpose. But these buildings are filled with creepy rooms like this that are just fodder for any creative mind. And so if you take time to Google images North Brother Island after you've read the novel, you will see many specific pictures that have references to events or just the details within the novel. And you'll know that those came from the actual facts. This is the doctor's cottage. This is where the antagonist in the Vines lives. And I'll leave it at that because there's no spoilers on this call. But there was always a head physician that was on the island, and this is where he lived. This is a hallway within the service building, which also served as a school. So during after World War II, when the veterans were living here, their children attended school here, and this was a high school. And then also the drug addicted teens in treatment went to school here. And another fascinating encounter I've had through my Facebook page is I've now met a woman. She wasn't technically born on North Brother Island, but her father was a veteran and her parents lived on the island after World War II. And so and her mother was pregnant with her and took a ferry, I think, over to the Bronx and had her. And then she spent the first 2 years of her life living on North Brother Island. And so if you look at my Facebook page or Instagram account, just under Shelley Nolden, you'll see pictures that she shared with me of her as just the cutest little baby with the island in the background. And in the one picture, you see this big concrete pavilion, and that was actually torn down shortly after that picture was taken. And speaking of that period when there were the drug addicted teens living here, I had another gentleman who told me that he used to take the ferry over to North Brother Island to play pickup games of softball with the teens that were in treatment. So, you know, Greer was talking earlier about how it's hard to always be using the secondary sources when you're writing a historical novel. But in this case, I've had several people come out of the woodwork with firsthand accounts of living on North Brother Island or visiting. This is the auditorium within the staff house. They used to show films here in the 1950s and also plays. And from what I read, this was actually the scene of a lot of contraband trading because they were in dark quarters. They were seated close together. And so there were things going on here that the staff likely wouldn't have approved of. And here's the basketball court or the gymnasium, also within the service building. This is the male dormitory that was used to house patients in the early 1900s. And this building plays an important role in the Vines. And I'll leave it at that. Oh, and then just one other point. On my website, if you're interested in finding more pictures, you can just Google image, but also, let's see if I can find the link. So on my website, if you click on this button that says resources and photography, it will take you to different photographers who have collections of photos on this island. You can check out some different videos and also all of my resources are here. So for anyone interested in doing some additional reading on their own.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like I could just like go deeper and deeper and deeper into this. So it's really wonderful. But then you've sort of laid on this fictional, spanning story onto the real events and the real places. And it's if anyone hasn't read the book yet, I will tell you that it's absolutely well worth reading. It's fantastic. But the map I want to go back to, because you mentioned the person who liked the map so much that you had it framed and sent to him. And I also, in my most recent book, The Arctic Fury, have a map. And we have a fun story about this. So this is the map. So the Arctic Fury is about a bunch of women who go to the Arctic. And so the map in my book is of Hudson Bay and the environs. And, there's a path where the women are traveling up that way. And Shelley and I have known each other for years and years because we used to be in a critique group together. So this is my map, and she was showing her map. And the funny thing is, the same person made both of those maps. Complete coincidence, like different publishers, different processes, different timelines. And mine just sort of showed up one day and they said, hey, do you like this map? And I said, yes, but yours was a little bit more involved. So you want to tell the group how your map came to pass?
So my map was designed by a very talented graphic designer named Travis Hausner. And the maps in Christopher Payne's coffee table book are all just two-dimensional, right? There's just a square and it's labeled the morgue. I wanted to create something that looked three-dimensional to give people a real sense of what it would be like to be on this island that doesn't exist anywhere as far as I've been able to find. So, like there's a first person on the moon, we created the first 3D map in North Brother Island. That's now the claim to fame. But it was not an easy thing to do. So we had Christopher Payne's flat 2D map, and I, in my head, knew what each building looked like. And because I'd spent so much time studying the pictures, I can basically have any picture put in front of me and I can tell you what building it is. But to translate that knowledge for somebody to then draw those buildings in a three-dimensional format was not an easy task. So we started with me sending him a copy of Christopher Payne's book to help him just start to get a sense for it. And then we went building by building, and we had to think about taking, we just saw the doctor's cottage. Well, you're looking at it from what angle in that picture, and then what direction does that building face on the actual island so that the 3D map has the building facing the correct way. That was a very involved process with Zoom calls, and Travis is a wonderful person. And we were joking about things about trying to look at the shadows from the sun to determine which way where the sun was, and thus which way the building was facing. And so he started by creating an image of each building facing the correct way, and then he planted them into the map. So we actually have these digital designs of the individual buildings separate from the map as well. So it was a hard won, beautiful map. And then I saw Greer's book and the name appeared, and I was like, yeah.
That guy, I know that guy. Exactly. That was funny. Well, it's funny because there's so much stuff. There's the writing of the actual book, and then there's just all of this other stuff about making a book that isn't the actual writing, and something like that map that it makes such a difference to the reader, but it's not the writing, it's this whole other thing with cover design and titles and all these other pieces of the puzzle that we have to worry about as authors, right? And I realized I should have asked you this at the beginning, but totally up to you. But do you want to read a page or two to get us oriented to the story, or do you want to just do questions? What are you thinking?
Sure, I can read a page, and I'll read the opening. And now that we've been talking about the pictures, the opening was inspired by a photograph of Christopher Payne. So if you do check out his collection after this call, you will see this. You will know exactly which of his photographs this is dealing with. So I'll just read the opening page. A thick keloid encircled the young woman's throat like a noose, ready to seize her last breath. though any one of the other faded wounds gripping her slender, muscular body should have already claimed it. Humming an achingly sad tune, she reached for an elixir bottle beside the cracked porcelain tub in which she stood. As she twisted, a tangled worm-like network of whip marks on her back met the glow of dawn pervading the forest. For the past 4 decades, indigenous and invasive plants have been hell-bent on destroying the remains of Riverside Hospital. Unchallenged by the collapsed outer wall of the first-floor bathroom, a shaft of sunlight irradiated her glistening skin. Maybe she's a ghost, Fingettler thought from behind a cottonwood as the woman lathered her hair. Thousands had died here. Many more had suffered. But not everyone who should have perished had. This only his family knew. A chill passed across the back of his sweat-slick neck, and he shivered. Finn didn't believe in the paranormal world. If ghosts were real, however, this shuttered contagion hospital would have spawned them. A distant shriek pierced his eardrums. The sound must have come from one of the black-crowned night herons nesting at North Brother Island's southern end. The woman tilted her head and released water from a camp shower bag. It flowed down her long hair to the top of her calves, where the dirt-caked tub shielded the rest of her from view. During his stint in the Peace Corps in Africa, not once had he seen a body so mutilated, nor in his 28 years on this earth, one so graceful. An impossible combination, yet there she stood. His heart pulsing, Finn pressed himself against a tree trunk, strangled by a mulberry vine. There was something off about this place he'd been longing to visit his entire life.
Got shivers. Yeah, I've seen comments, people that gave him the chills as well. Like when you were talking about the General Slocum disaster earlier, like it gets you. It like does that.
Yeah,
So
that
there's
actually,
more of that.
every time I would work on that, it would remind me of my dad, because my dad, he hates to see any child suffer. And so because most of the victims in the General Slocum, 1,100 over, had perished, it was mostly women and children, because those were the ones that were attending the Sunday school event. So as I was writing this, I was like, I really want Steven Spielberg to make a movie out of this. But if he does, I know that my dad will not be able to handle that scene.
It's like one of my books in The Magician's Lie, as you know from reading it, I used a real life event, the Iroquois theater fire in Chicago.
Yeah.
And similarly, it was a fire that broke out, and it's all of the same sort of stuff. Like the exit doors opened inward instead of outward, and people couldn't get out. And it was a daytime matinee during the Christmas holiday. It was kids, you know, trapped in this terrible environment. So all of these historical things that we, you know, at least in some cases, like in the Iroquois theater fire, that was the genesis of modern fire codes, where, okay, this terrible thing happened, but something good will come of it. But unfortunately, that's not always the case from these tragedies. So at least with North Brother Island, there's some, you know, some of that where you can say some good things have come of this, but then in other ways, you can say, well, have we really learned anything about whether we should, you know, quarantine people, or whether there's a smarter way to deal with the science of it? Which leads me into my next question, which is, when you started writing this some time ago, worldwide pandemic was not really on the table. Like we had been through SARS and Ebola and those sort of things that weren't as catastrophic in America as the current pandemic has been. So how has it been for you with how it felt when you were writing it versus how it has felt now that it's being released into this world where this is happening?
Right. Well, the original genesis for having the plot deal with a woman who has this superior immune system, for focusing on the concept of vaccine and good health and achieving the end of disease at any cost, is the theme of my book, was the fact that when I first came across, when I was elbowed in the side by Rob and introduced to North Brother Island, I was just finishing treatment for leukemia. So I was still physically, emotionally healing from that. And I had a lot of anxiety. I was very afraid of dying. And so naturally, with the book set in North Brother Island, since it was a quarantine hospital, diseases were an obvious topic for a plot. But to me, there was such this fear of death that I started with this character who essentially cannot die because of her strong immune system. And so I think there was obviously that's not attainable, but the idea of not having to be afraid of death was very appealing to me at the time. I've also always just been fascinated by infectious diseases. I did my high school term paper that, my mom, helped me with. It's on Ebola. My mom's one of the reasons I became a writer. She's an excellent writer. And so I think that interest in microbiology then dovetailed nicely with this. So yeah, the plot was there before COVID was here. But it was interesting a year ago, January, because I had spent so much time researching pandemics, ways to contain them, studying historical events, the historical pandemics. When news first started coming out of Wuhan, I was terrified, and irrationally so at the time, when other people who don't have PTSD from leukemia were not. And I ordered sanitizer, Clorox wipes mid-January. And my mom humored me with going to Costco, and so she could push a second cart, because at that time I was convinced that this was going to be a pandemic. And so we filled 2 carts, and it was so embarrassing. I might have told the clerk that checked us out a white lie that we just bought a lake house and we're stocking it. Might have happened. And so, but my mom was good. She understands that this, you don't just have cancer and then it's gone forever. It lives with you, and the anxieties do. And so we stocked up, we got toilet paper. I like to think that I didn't affect anybody else's toilet paper shortage, because that was in January. And, then everyone knows what happened over this coming months. And it was very eerie having written about this and then seeing what was happening, particularly in New York, that was so hard hit early on. So thank you, Mom, by the way. I think she...
Good. Always awesome to have the family support for the author stuff and for all of the other life stuff, right? Especially. So that's good. I have a couple more questions. I want other people to put in their questions. Again, we definitely want to know what you want to talk about, questions that you have about the book, questions you have about the process. I want to talk a little bit about the bookstore, because this is a bookstore that you know well in your area. And that's part of why we're here doing a virtual event, is to support the bookstore. So do you want to talk a little bit about Boswell Books and what makes it a special place?
Sure. First I'll start wide, then we'll go narrow to Boswell. I just really admire business owners, entrepreneurs. Not a huge fan of Amazon, given how many businesses it has sent out of business. So I think it's just always great to support local bookstores. The staff at Boswell is so incredibly friendly and helpful. And when we're in there with our girls, they have spot on recommendations. And so if you're local, I highly recommend you make a trip over there, and if you're not, to support them online. But I just think it's so important for our communities to support local bookstores. So please consider doing so.
I'm seeing a question in the chat about how was the publishing journey for you? And I think everybody's got very different stories, but the stories that I've heard of publishing journeys from my friends, there are very, very few of them who say, I wrote a book, I got an agent, and I got published, and it was great. They're usually much longer stories. So do you want to tell us some or all of your long stories, Shelley?
Yes, mine is a long story. This novel was a lot of rounds of revision. I'm a literary agent who is a developmental agent. So, we'd send her a draft. 2 months later, I'd get a letter back with, you need to change X, Y, Z, AA, B, it's like quite a list. There were a few times where it felt a little overwhelming, but we persist. And so then when it was finally time when it was ready to sell, and we all thought it was going to sell quickly. She took it out to the top 5 publishers, and the feedback from them was that they loved the writing, but it was too dark. And they just didn't think the trend at the time was that dark fiction would sell. This was in December of 2018. So, we shelved it. I started working on other things. And then the pandemic struck. And all of a sudden, the idea of a contagion in New York City was no longer dark. It was reality and very topical. And so I decided to work with a small press so that we could move faster, since this book was sitting pretty on the shelf, but had, not been the right trend for the time. And that's how I was able to have it come out, while we're still unfortunately dealing with this pandemic, but it's moving in the right direction. So, as Greer says, there's not a lot of overnight successes in this business.
Yeah. There are a couple, but in the pantheon of people I know, very, very few. And lots of overnight successes, 20 years in the making. A lot of people, Orphan Train was Christina Baker Klein's 4th book. Like the Alice Network was I don't even know what book it was of Kate Quinn's, but it certainly wasn't her first book. Like sometimes the one that breaks out is part of a much longer trend. So we've got another question in the Q&A from Kat, who asks, what made you decide to add the strong German influence in the vines?
So a lot of that did have to do with the fact that the Slocum, the ship that landed on the island, had the German passengers on it. Also, unfortunately, there was a lot of medical experimentation during World War II by the Nazis. And there are elements of science fiction in this book, but one of these themes does have to do with what expense for one person can be justified to benefit the greater good. And it touches on different aspects of medical experimentation. And, one of the other influences for me was this amazing nonfiction book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, an African-American woman who in 1951 had a cell culture taken when she had cervical cancer. And the scientists realized that her cells continued to grow in cell cultures. And now these cells are all over the world and have been commercialized and used for massive research. So there's a lot of science ethical questions. And so it felt like a natural fit that the Nazis were perpetrators of this and to have a German family involved. Even though I'm German, I love Germans. So it was both the negative in that aspect, but also the positive of what that community went through with the Slocum fire.
Nobody is just, nobody's just a villain or a hero, right? Everybody's a little bit more complex than that. So whatever the background is, you're able to render them with more complexity and with more subtlety than just, broad brush, which is great. It's an important part of fiction. Nonfiction, I feel like the Henrietta Lacks story, like there are serious villains in that story, for sure. And that's just reality. We've got another question in the chat about the sequel. Are you working on the next in the series here?
Yes, that's what I do when I set my alarm at 5 a.m. I am working on the sequel. The tentative name for it is The Coins. There'll be large relationship themes, which should mean something to those who have read it, hopefully. But in terms of the historical elements, one of the aspects of the island's history, which I did not mention before, is in 1780, a British frigate, the HMS Hussar, sunk in the East River. There used to be a lot of rock formations hidden underwater that were later gotten rid of through dynamite. But at the time, the passage was very treacherous. The ship was on its way to Boston, It was rumored to be carrying a Golden Guinea payroll for British soldiers during the Revolutionary War. And it was rumored to be carrying 80 shackled revolutionary soldiers. The British denied that the ship had the Golden Guinea payroll, but they have made multiple salvage attempts following the sinking. So that kind of negates their claims that there's nothing valuable on it. Throughout history, there have been other salvage attempts, and the ship still has not been found. So I'm fascinated by the fact that I read a recent article that said that they think that the treasure on it could be worth $500 million. And it's still somewhere in the East River. So I'm plan to pull that more into the novel. And in the first one, Cora, the main character, early in the novel, finds a single golden guinea on the shore of North Brother Island. So that gave me a stepping stone for more plot development in the sequel. But I mean, who doesn't like to think about a sunken treasure ship in New York City?
Sure. That's fantastic. Love it. We're gonna, comments in the chat. Mind blown, so excited. Yes, it sounds fantastic. And again, if you haven't read this one yet, it's fantastic. But now I'm like salivating for number 2. So that's great. We do have some more time left. So again, if anybody else has more questions, I love to talk about I feel like there's this image of writers as being super solitary and just doing things on their own. But from our critique group experience, certainly I feel like my novel, I need other people. I need them a lot. I like to go off and write my first draft by myself, but then bring it to people. So do you want to talk a little bit about how critique and beta reading and collaborating with your editor and everybody has benefited your writing?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, because you've benefited my writing. And so
I wasn't trying to, I wasn't pitching, but
it was a great setup for a thank you though. Yeah, it's, when you're writing a novel, you have such a clear picture of what's going on in the story in your mind. The thing that you may be missing is that may not perfectly match what you've put on the page. So it's critically important to get outside views in terms of somebody coming new to something and what they are taking away from the reading. I would say, as I'm working on this next book, I was just talking to my editor this morning that I think I've gotten so used to the fully developed divines that now that I'm back in this early drafting mode, I'm putting pressure on myself that every sentence is polished, every detail's there in the first draft. And so we were just having this discussion this morning about you just need to finish a vomit draft. And that's, an awful term, but it's you just got to get the story out, all the words on the page, and then there's plenty of time to start refining and getting beta readers. But sometimes it's not good to get beta readers too early because it can be embarrassing.
Yeah. It's so hard because I'm doing a second in a series for the first time in my life. And so, yeah, the first one's all polished and beautiful. And the second one is an absolute disaster, but it's 125,000 words of disaster, which is better than not, so it's got to go through that phase of not being right in order to get it right, at least for me. And it sounds like for you, that's just part of the process for some writers.
Right. I just saw in the comments that Mary's on, and I don't know if I can say this without crying. Mary, I met through my author Facebook page. She said she just finished the book. Thank you, Mary. Mary donates platelets on a weekly basis. And when I was diagnosed with leukemia, the type of leukemia I had, your platelets don't mature. So the biggest risk to me initially was that I would bleed out internally and die. My daughter at the time was 18 months old. She was not allowed to visit in the hospital because, according to my oncologist, if she hugged me too tight, she could kill me. And, other people from this disease, they have died through this internal bleeding, where literally as your blood cells are bumbling along through your veins, if one nicks a vein and breaks open the vein, you could die. And so I had no platelets, and I was receiving platelets every day when I was inpatient, sometimes twice a day. And so then I met Mary, and she mentioned that she donates platelets. And I just think it's so incredible that people do that. And I was telling her, I'm like, you have saved lives. The people like Mary, whose platelets went into my body, I wouldn't be here if they didn't do that act of love and generosity. And so, so thank you, Mary. Thank you for joining tonight, and thank you for what you do for others.
Thank you. That's how now I'm like,
I know,
a little
right?
choked up myself, but thank you. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's absolutely wonderful. On a little bit of a lighter note, we have one more question. I think we'll have time for one or two more questions before we wrap up. But Kat was asking, if the Vines were made into a movie, do you have an actress in mind to play Cora?
Oh gosh.
Because Cora is like the center of this. Cora is an amazing character. And so you need somebody who can, you know, command the screen and sort of the center of this story. Have you thought about it? Some authors like have somebody in mind the whole time, but some.
I have not. The woman who did my audiobook is originally from Scotland, and Cora is of Irish descent. And so I loved that Jess gave Cora a very subtle Irish accent. But I had not thought about that with the movie. I really have liked trying to come up with characters for yearbooks, though. That's my specialty. And never mind if they were perfect for the role 30 years ago, I still think, you know, they should be the one.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's my husband also suggests, like, don't think about when you're dream casting, don't think about just who people actually are. But like, if you want to cast like 1970 Sean Connery, like,
right.
You know, do that, because it's all dream casting anyway. But yeah,
it would need to be somebody who's got some muscles.
We've got some good suggestions here. So we've got a couple of
Yes.
great suggestions in the chat. Jessica Chastain, who can do anything. Angelina Jolie, who, to your point, has muscles, so she could definitely pull it off. For some reason, I was picturing Alicia Vikander, who I think also did a Tomb Raider movie. So maybe it's just like a Tomb Raider,
then that would work.
Zone.
I do. It's like a family joke now, Steven Spielberg, because through all those rewrites, it was always a fantasy that Steven Spielberg would want to do the movie. And I used to, with a full-time job, to get rewrites in. There were times I was waking up at 4 a.m. every morning, and I'd ask Rob to make sure that I actually rose out of the bed instead of just turning off the alarm. And there was one morning, I must have hit the snooze button like twice. Turned my head, there's a glow of a cell phone near me, and I let my eyes focus, and he brought up Steven Spielberg's picture on his cell phone, and there's Steven Spielberg like 3 inches from my face.
Staring you in the
Hey,
eyes.
I'm getting out of bed. So apparently it worked.
That's great. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, whenever anybody asks me the question, like, how do you balance full-time work and writing, and being a mom, the answer is always, well, not very well. Like, it's completely overwhelming, like most of the time. So yeah, kudos to you for managing everything that you've got, and still making this, you know, this beautiful book.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being here tonight. A last question, or everyone's got to get back to their wines with their vines? Maybe that's been going on since we can't see the faces. True.
Yes. It's not just me. So yeah, so somebody's picturing Brittany Murphy from Don't Say a Word. Yeah, she's got an intense vibe. That's good. But yeah, we have just a couple of minutes to wrap up. So I think if we bring Daniel back, he can help us finish up the event. And again, thanks to Boswell for hosting. This is really wonderful and great work.
When's your sequel scheduled to come out, or is it in the early phases?
It's in the draft phase, so
okay,
as quickly as I can get it done.
Oh boy. Well, we're all looking forward to it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you both for a wonderful evening, and thanks everybody for coming. We wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you, and hope to see you another event. So good night.
Have a good night. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.